Welcome to the Jaron Jarvis channel. I am Jaron Jarvis. Today, I would like to introduce to you, the half-burnt house. Growing up, my family lived in the suburbs on the north side of Brisbane, Australia. Back then, most of the houses were decently sized and sat on a quarter-acre of land. This was fine for BMX bikes, and the footpaths saw a lot of roller skates and skateboards. But as my brother and I reached our teens, and spurred by the crusty demons of dirt videos, we started to look to trail bikes for that next level fun. Sadly, listening to the rin of a two-stroke motor isn't most suburbanites' idea of a relaxing weekend, so despite saving up our paper run money for nearly 2 years and buying a small, cheap dirt bike each, we didn't have anywhere to ride them. So we mentioned our quandary to an uncle who lived on hilly property up in the hinterland of the Sunshine Coast. "Our land's no good, but I'll ask Skell and Joan next door. They're on 22 acres, smiled Uncle Pat at a Christmas lunch, one of the few times the extended family ever got to see each other. Early in the new year, Pat gave us a call and said his neighbors would be happy to let us ride on their property, and we could stay with Pat and Auntie Helen. So my brother Jason and I packed our swags and loaded the bikes into the back of Dad's ute, and we were away. It was crowded in the 3-seater cab for that hour-and-a-half drive, but we were too excited to care. We arrived at Pat and Helen's around lunchtime on a beautiful summer's day and unloaded our gear. After chucking our sleeping bags and clothes into their spare bedroom and waving goodbye to Dad, we pulled on our helmets, fired up the bikes and went hooning along the bush track that connected the two properties. Skell was already waiting for us as we burst up out of the overgrown scrub and through the rickety old gate. We'd met Skell and Joan several times at Pat and Helen's place, and he waved to us with a toothy grin. To this day, I never knew Skell's real name, but he'd earned the nickname for being taller and painfully thin and gangly, like a skeleton. He didn't mind, and sometimes would pop his top dentures partway out and gurgle-oogle-boogle to make the younger rellies squeal. He showed us where the fresh water tap was, and gave us directions to the start of the bush track they'd cut through the rear of his property. "You'll see a big red shed a few hundred meters in," he said. "There's a few jerry cans of two-stroke fuel in there, they're the blue ones. The green barrels have diesel in them, which is no good for your bikes. Darvo will be home around 3, and will probably come out for a bash with you, so keep an ear out and don't smash into him." Jason and I grinned and nodded. We'd met Skell's son Darvo once before, and he was a huge, bearded, heavily tattooed bloke, but always quick to have a joke and a laugh. We held him in a bit of awe because we suspected he was an outlaw bikie, but we remembered him as a really good bloke and were looking forward to having a ride with him. It made us feel a bit grown-up. "Oh, and before you piss off, listen closely," Skell gestured with a bony hand to turn off the bikes before he continued. "At the western edge of the track is a dry creek bed that runs north to south. Don't go past that point, right? There's old buildings out there from over 100 years ago, and they're all shitty and falling apart. Pat would have me head if anything happened to you, so stick to the track, right?" That immediately hooked my interest, but Jace and I looked at each other and nodded again before kicking the bikes back into tinny life, and spitting up rooster tails as we raced each other to the track entrance. Ever since I was a little kid, I've been fascinated by tales of ghosts and aliens and evil spirits and the like. Australia is an old land, and the Aborigines have tons of stories about the magical dreamtime beings like the Wandjina. Combine that with some of the horrible things done to the natives and convicts during the years following European settlement, certain places have a reputation for being very haunted. But as we ramped our bikes off dirt humps and skidded around trees and scrub, I soon forgot about such things, and old Skell's warning. In what felt like no time, it was 2 p.m. and the day was stiflingly hot. The hiss of the cicadas nearly drowned out even the revving of the bikes. Jace and I had pulled up in the shade of the trees to thirstily drain the last of our water bottles, right on the bank of the dry creek bed. Jace gestured to an old wooden bridge that crossed to the far side, about 20 meters away. "What do you reckon?" he asked with a grin. Jace, ever the daredevil, always making dares and bets. "Nah man," Skell said, "not to. Besides, if we get the bikes stuck or something, it's even further to walk back. I rocked my bike from side to side and listened for the slosh of fuel. We'd only topped up the tanks about half an hour earlier, but I hated the thought of having to push a trail bike several kilometers in this heat. Even in the shade I was sweating under my helmet and chest armor. Pussy. Jace revved his engine and dropped the clutch, spraying me with gravel and dead leaves as he sped towards the bridge. As he turned onto it, I started my own bike and reluctantly followed. I was the oldest, thus expected to be the most responsible. If Jace stacked it or got into some other mischief, I'd be the one who got in trouble for letting him out of my sight. A couple of planks fell out of the ancient bridge as we rattled across it, but we made it safely to the other side. Here the path was nearly completely overgrown with lantana and other spiky scrub. Jace wasn't deterred, levering his bike between them, leaving small scraps of his jersey behind. I kept following, hoping that the trail would soon die out and we'd be forced to turn back. We'd only ridden a few hundred meters, and already I was bleeding from a dozen small nicks and scratches when suddenly the track opened into a large clearing. We both braked and put our feet down to look around. Clouds had moved across the sun, giving some small relief from the heat, but the humidity was still crushing. The crows and cicadas fallen silent too, and I shivered. The scene in front of us was almost surreal. An ancient farmhouse mostly stood towards the rear of the clearing, but sometime in the distant past the front half had burnt down, leaving the rooms open to the elements like a dollhouse. The wild, barely tameable Aussie bush appeared almost leaning away from the decrepit structure like it was diseased. The grass was short as if it was regularly cropped by cattle or goats, but there was no living livestock to be seen. Instead, the ground was littered with cattle carcasses in varying stages of decomposition. The stinking, bloated frames of recently dead bulls and cows lay closest to the half-burnt house. Out on the edges of the clearing, nothing was left but collapsed, gnawed upon bones. Cool, laughed Jace as he kicked his bike into gear, but I grabbed his sleeve and reached over to flick his kill switch. Hey! He yelled, swatting my hand away. Dude, look at this place. It's messed up. I replied, my heart beating heavily in my chest. Look, there isn't even any flies on the fresh ones. It was true, nothing living stirred in or anywhere around the clearing. So what? Skell probably just poisoned them. Jace started his bike again. If you're too pussy, stay here. Why would he poison his own? Wait. But it was too late. Jace was standing up on his pegs as he maneuvered between the sharp horns and bare ribs towards the house. I felt sick to my stomach as I rode after him, following the path he'd picked. There must have been over 100 dead cows laying around. The whole scene felt so unnatural, and my imagination cruelly started to dig through all of the ghost stories I'd ever read to present me with the worst possible scenarios. This was back in the early 90s, so we didn't have mobile phones, or even shortwave radios. If something terrible happened, we were stuffed. Even if Darvo did come out looking for us, we'd been warned against coming this far, so would he bother to search beyond the bridge? The stink of the freshest carcasses was absolutely horrific. It powered its way into the back of my sinuses and took up residence in my throat. I stopped and took off my helmet, and pulled up my shirt to over my nose and mouth, but it didn't help much. Jace had propped his bike up against what was left of the internal staircase and was already clambering over the mostly destroyed furniture in the lower rooms. Jackson? Shit man, come see this. Jace was bent over, peering at something in the blackened detritus near the far wall. I gingerly picked my way over to where he stood, wincing every time something cracked or crumbled under my boots. As I reached him, Jace turned to me with a worried grin and pointed at the floor where a skeletal, human arm and hand reached from a scorched and warped trapdoor. Now, we don't really have cellars or basements in our houses here in Queensland, Australia. I've never understood why. They'd be a nice, cool place to store things during the scorching summers. So a basement with a skeleton was well outside our experience. Dude, don't touch it. We've got to tell Skell and the police. I felt panic start to rise in my chest. What if Skell already knows, and that's why he told us not to come here? What if Skell killed whoever that is? We can't let him know what we found. For the first time today, Jace looked as worried as I felt. I turned to make my way back to the bikes and froze. Covering the ground and all of the dead cattle, all the way to the tree line, was a sea of crows. Huge, blue-black suckers with pale eyes. I heard Jace mutter something under his breath, but we were both frozen with terror. The crows were all staring right at us, unflinching, absolutely still. The sky was still flat, dead and grey, and there was no breeze to even ruffle a feather. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I felt like I wanted to vomit. What the hell kind of Stephen King shit had we stumbled into? Suddenly, the boom of a shotgun blast shattered the scene and the crows were startled into squawking flight. The flapping and fluttering was nearly deafening as the hundreds of carrion birds whirred and whirled and wheeled into the sky. On the far side of the clearing where we'd entered, Darvo sat on an old 4-stroke Yamaha, warily pointing the shotgun at any crows that strayed too close. Within moments they'd all vanished, leaving the clearing as we'd found it. Darvo tucked the gun into a swag strapped to the seat behind him and shouted something, gesturing us over. We needed no more encouragement. Jace and I made a mad scramble to our bikes and tore out of the house like the devil himself was on our tails. As we reached Darvo, he wheeled his own bike around and led us back through the narrow, scratching bush track to the bridge. We rattled over it one by one, not trusting the ancient structure to hold our combined weight, and wordlessly rode back to the big shed. Darvo kicked down his stand and retrieved the shotgun. For a split second I thought he would shoot us to hide the grisly secret of the half-burnt house, but he just unloaded the other shell while shaking his head. I knew you little bastards wouldn't be able to help yourselves, he grinned through his enormous bushranger beard, but I'm not fucking around when I tell you this. Do not ever mention what you saw here to anyone. And I bloody well mean it. He waved the empty shotgun at both of us for emphasis. Jace and I both started to ask 100 questions at once, but Darvo frowned and shook his head. Nope, it's none of your damn business. This is old family shit, and the less you know, the better for all of us. But mark my words, boys, you will not ever speak of this. Not to Pat, not to your parents, and not the fucking police. That cowed us into silence, and we mutely nodded our agreement. We solemnly rode back to Pat and Helen's without saying anything else. They were surprised to see us so glum, but didn't probe. Over a very subdued dinner I saw Pat exchange a knowing look with Helen, who just shook her head slightly. They must have known something. I just wish I knew what it was. We never did go riding on Skell's land again. I did see Darvo one more time a few years ago when Skell passed away. I got to visit the half-burnt house again, too. But that's a story that'll have to wait.